webinar is the first in a series of webinars that we are doing on advocacy in the Maine Legislature. Today we will be talking about how a bill becomes a law and more details about the functioning of the legislature and all of that. Next week we'll be talking about how to effectively contact your legislator. And then on the third week, we will be talking about how to track the issues that you care about. The fourth week is one I'm especially excited for. It's a sort of, how did we end up here? How's the Maine Legislature this unique thing it is? So really excited for that. And then finally, we'll be doing Advocacy 201 for continuing and growing in your legislative advocacy. So as I mentioned, we have a couple of great guests here today. I believe our second guest, Bob Howell, will be joining us shortly, and I will let him introduce himself when he is able to join. So I will tag in John Brodigan to introduce himself and tell us a little bit about himself.
Thank you, Will. It's a pleasure to be here with you. And I am John Brodigan. I'm an attorney with Democracy Maine, and I did serve 2 terms in the legislature from 2005 through 2008 on the Utilities and Energy Committee and the Insurance and Financial Services Committee. I have a legal practice and public policy advising consulting practice, and I've been part of this team for quite a while, and I probably know many of you, but it's very good to be here. And I think Bob has just joined us.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
If you want to wait until Bob gets in, we can just move forward, or whatever you think is best, Will.
I think that's a good idea. I think he joined on the attending side, so we just have to wait for him to join as a panelist.
Okay, well, I'll just give a little background then. The Maine legislature is, like almost all the other legislatures in the country, a bicameral legislature with a House and Senate. Do you want to, Will, do you want to walk through the order of the agenda of the presentation?
Sure. Let's go ahead and do that.
We'll talk something about the basics of the legislature, the process of writing legislation, how it moves through the committees. Then it goes to the House and Senate for consideration, and some of the dynamics and the parliamentary considerations as it moves through that process. And then what happens after that, typically a bill gets presented to the governor, and then we'll talk a little bit about some unique factors that are in play for 2021 because of the COVID restrictions.
Great. Do you want to start us off on the basics while we wait for Bob to join?
Absolutely, happy to. So as you said, 151 members of the House of Representatives. Typically ends up being, less than 10,000 people in each district, 35 members in the Senate. We have all senators and representatives serve for 2-year terms. They're allowed to have 4 2-year terms under our term limit law. It is quite common for members to serve their full 4 terms. And then it's even common for them to continue serving by moving to the other chamber for a term or 2 and then coming back. So term limits has changed the dynamic somewhat, but you still see some people up in the legislature who've been there for many, many terms and really know their way around the State House. So the legislature, there is a legislature that is considered the 2-year term is the legislature. Right now, we're in the 130th legislature since Maine's founding in 1820. The numbers don't quite add up because it hasn't always worked that way, but we just finished the 129th. We're just starting the 130th legislature. Under the Constitution, there are 2 sessions to the legislature. In the odd numbered year, the sessions begin in January and run until about the middle of June. And then in the even numbered year, there is a shorter session, which is called the second regular session of the legislature, which begins in January and runs until April. The second session is supposed to be more limited to only appropriations bills and bills of an emergency nature. But it is quite common for bills to be carried forward from the first session for further consideration in the second session. So the legislature can be really quite busy even in the even numbered years. But that's the general organization of a legislative session. Why don't we keep going through this first part, and then we'll stop and take a break for questions, and then we'll connect Bob back in as we can do that. So after the session ends, both in the short session and in the long regular session, there is a period of time where the governor has a chance to review what the legislature has enacted and sign or veto or not sign or veto any bill that comes across her desk. And this, the day that the legislature all comes back to consider those bills that have been vetoed and whether or not to override them, obviously it's called veto day. And it's usually, about 10 days or 2 weeks after the legislative session adjourns, or at least after it concludes its regular business. And then finally, there can be special sessions of the legislature at any time that they're not in regular session. There's two ways at least two ways the legislature can be called in a special session. One is by the governor, and the other is by call by the legislature itself. But when the legislature calls itself into special session, it has to have consent of all of the major caucuses of the legislature, and that's not as common as you might think. There's often political considerations that keep one or more caucuses from agreeing to come back into session. Okay. Let's see, Bob, do you want to jump in here with the details on the 130th?
Sure, and I'm sorry I'm late. I was frantically looking for the panelist link in an email from Will, but it was actually sent by Nadia and I overlooked it. So we are now in the beginning of the 130th Maine Legislature. Those numbers go for 2 years until the next election, November of the even numbered year. There are 151 voting members of the Maine House. There are 35 members of the Senate, although that number has changed over the years. We once had 32 senators with 2 from each county. And you can see on this slide the partisan or unpartisan composition of the members of each body. I guess you're advancing the slides, Will. Legislative elections refers to elections conducted by members of the legislature. These are the positions that legislators pick. The 2 presiding officers are the Speaker of the House and the President of the Senate. There are what are referred to as constitutional officers because 3 of the 4 are actually named in the Constitution. The auditor isn't actually named in the Constitution. The caucus leaders are the folks who lead the 2 major party caucuses. That is to say, the Democrats and the Republicans in the House and the Democrats and Republicans in the Senate. Each of those 4 caucuses designates a floor leader and an assistant floor leader. These are the current members of leadership. You will see that the second position is currently vacant because Senator Nate Libby, Democrat of Lewiston, or I should say Androscoggin, since senators are listed by the county in which they live, not the municipality. He has stepped down from his leadership post, but he's not leaving the legislature, but he's taken on a new job outside the legislature with some pretty heavy responsibilities. So I wouldn't be surprised if Senator Vitelli moves up to that position, but I don't have any inside scoop on that at the moment. We have what are called joint committees which means that the members are from both bodies. We have 18 standing committees. Each has 3 senators and 10 members. The party that has the majority in those 2 bodies has a majority of members from their body on the committee. So the Democrats are controlling both bodies, so they have either 6 or 7 members out of the 10 House members. It varies some, and they have 2 of the 3 senators. These are standing committees, which are more or less permanent, although nothing's really permanent up there. And occasionally they will appoint a select committee to focus on something more narrow than the jurisdiction of the standing committees. And those usually are around for a year or 2 or 3.
Bob, where do independents fit into this?
They do have seats on committees. Let me say that the appointments to the committees are made by the presiding officer technically, but Senator Jackson, for example, is the presiding officer. He's a Democrat. However, the Republican member from the Senate on these committees is a practical matter chosen by the Republican floor leaders. There was a bit of a kerfuffle earlier this year. There were 2 different Republicans who were unhappy with the committee appointments their own party floor leaders gave them. And at least one of them, Senator Rick Bennett, appealed to Senator Jackson to override his party members. And Senator Jackson, I think for good reason, declined to do that. The other was a House member who'd been on the committee where we spend a lot of time, Veterans Legal Affairs. He didn't get his committee assignment and he unenrolled from the party. These are the current joint standing committees. We spend most of our time at the very last committee, Veterans and Legal Affairs. I expect we may have some business in state and local government. We certainly pay close attention to the Appropriations and Financial Affairs Committee because that's where the budget's put together, including the budget for 2 agencies we care a lot about, the Secretary of State and the Ethics Commission.
So let me stop there really quickly because I see we already have some questions coming in both via the chat and the Q&A, and I'd certainly encourage people to keep submitting them. So let me ask a couple of these questions that I see in here. First one is it ever hard to decide which committee hears a bill?
Occasionally. The process works like this, although it has changed a little bit under COVID. Well, they're more than clerical people, but the clerk of the House and the Secretary of the Senate normally make a recommendation of the committee of reference. This year, because there aren't floor sessions to review and act on those recommendations are in fact where the bill goes. It's usually, I think, based on what title of Maine law is being affected. 21A, for example, the election laws. That bill's going to go to VLA. But you may have some bills that affect multiple titles. You might have a bill that affects Title 36, the taxation laws, and maybe something in Title 35A dealing with utilities. Maybe a bit of a flip of a coin there. Normally it's fairly clear, but occasionally there'll be a fight over committee of reference, or sometimes a committee will receive a bill, they'll look at it and they say, no, that really belongs somewhere else, and they'll refer it over.
Great. Another question, are there subcommittees?
Not officially, but a committee may designate a subgroup to go out and work on some aspect of a bill and report back. They're ad hoc groups.
Great. What is the difference between a senator and a representative?
Power.
Somebody could have fun with that. Well, the first one that comes to mind is that even though you have a House chair and a Senate chair on each committee, the senator runs the committee unless the senator chooses to let the House chair take the gavel or has to leave to go to the bathroom or something. I'm sure there are other things. What's your response, John?
Well, senators represent about 40,000 people, and a member of the House represents about 8,000 people. So there's a lot more constituents. Campaigning is different, and as a result, there's a greater amount of power and authority in any one person's hands as a member of the Senate than in the House. Senators are in the majority party are almost always committee chairs, and even if they're a brand new senator, so they have that responsibility as well. And it's just a smaller, more intimate body. And like the U.S. Congress, you know, there's at least some pretension that the Senate has more collegiality and more tradition and more, you know, sort of relationship based legislating, but I'm not sure if that's really fact or fiction anymore. The House as a body is, you know, very diverse, very energetic, lots of ideas flying around, and very little time to think about all of them, and it kind of moves more quickly, I think, in some ways than the Senate as a body.
Great. Question here, why are tribal members non-voting?
Well, I can say a little about that, and it's really a very long and complicated history going all the way back to the time of when Maine was still part of Massachusetts, when there were tribal sort of observers to the legislative process, and they had different status at different times throughout history. And it has to do with tribal sovereignty and the Indian Land Claims Act, and a variety of different decisions. And it is a point of discussion in terms of relationships of sovereignty. And you know, you might think that the tribes would like to have representation in the bodies as a voting member, and perhaps maybe some of them do, but it's also possible that as a separate sovereign, that they actually would not want to have a representative in the body, as an indicator that, you know, that they're not actually separate and sovereign. So it's a complicated relationship, is about the best you can say. It's a very good question, and the answer would require probably several chapters in a book about tribal relations.
Residents of the different tribes living on reservations are, however, represented by voting members. I don't remember just where the boundaries is, but the Pleasant Point Reservation is near Eastport, so I assume that the representative who represents the city of Eastport also represents Perry and the Pleasant Point Reservation. And likewise, on the Senate side, Senator Moore, her district in Washington County would encompass probably both Pleasant Point and Peter Dana Reservation.
It's sort of analogous to the role that representatives of the city of Washington, D.C. play in the U.S. Congress in some ways.
Mm-hmm. One more question I see here for now. When voting, and I assume this is in committee, does the Senate vote count for more than a House vote?
No, they don't. Although there's an informal rule in committees, the 3-senator rule, where if you have a bill and if you do not get any of the 3 senators on the bill in the committee, it's a very bad sign for that bill. So they do have that informal kind of traditional perceived power, but the votes count equally.
Yeah, there's nothing binding on other members of the legislature based on how members of a committee vote. The other members, when the bill gets to the floor of the House and Senate, are perfectly free to vote any way they want on what are called the committee reports. We're going to get into committee reports here in this next segment.
Yes, we are. This is the title segment, How a Bill Becomes a Law in Maine. And we're just walking through that legislative process. Who would like to take this one up to start?
John, we swapped halfway through the first section. Do you want to do that again?
Do you want to, if you want to start and do a few slides, and then I'll.
Yeah, Will, let me know when I'm about halfway through this batch of slides.
Okay, we'll do.
So the question is, who can submit legislation? Well, the answer is all of the above. However, as you'll see on the next slide, it requires a legislator to put his or her name on the bill as the sponsor before it can be printed and posted. That's different than, at least it used to be in Massachusetts, where you would see bills sponsored by a citizen. Their name would actually be on the bill. Now, whether that's still true, I don't know. There is a rule that says that can be 10 legislators' names on a bill. There's a primary sponsor and then co-sponsors, and the first co-sponsor from the other body is considered the lead. So for example, if Representative Smith is the primary sponsor and Senator Jones is the first senator, Senator Jones would be the lead Senate co-sponsor. I don't know that that designation has any particular import, but that's how it's thought of. So a legislator has an idea, or anybody else, and it may come from, and often does, from a constituent or from an organization such as ours. The sponsor will submit the bill to an office called the Office of the Reviser of Statutes. And regardless of whether that bill is fully drafted, the reviser still has the final word on how that bill is drafted, not from the point of view of content, but format and so forth. It is then assigned an LD, or legislative document number, and gets printed. We aren't going to see many printed bills now because we're not at the State House to pick up pieces of paper, but they're also all posted on the legislature's website. And then, as we saw earlier, and talked about how the legislature then refers the bill to a committee. Unlike many states and the US Congress, it is almost never the case that a bill goes without a public hearing. The public gets to comment on everything. And the general rule is 2 weeks notice, although the leadership can waive that. And they sometimes do late in the session when they start to run out of time. The public hearing process is going to be very different in the COVID era because the State House is not open to the public. The committee members and their staff will use Zoom, just as we're doing right now. And anyone who wants to testify before the committee, as long as they let the committee know, I think the committee is saying at least 30 minutes before they begin, that person will be sent the Zoom link. Otherwise, the rest of the world gets to watch and listen on YouTube. The Maine legislature, just like Lady Gaga, has its own YouTube channel. And when you get to that channel, then you can select any one of the committees plus the House and the Senate. So you can watch the floor sessions of the House and the Senate, as well as committees in session. And these events are recorded, and you can go back on YouTube and replay them. With rare exception, following a public hearing, and usually on a different day, a bill is given a work session. These work sessions are open to the public, but it's not an opportunity for the public to say anything. It's an opportunity for legislators to discuss among themselves in broad daylight, theoretically, what they're going to do with the bill. Now, I will say there has been a trend in recent years, nay, decades, since I was a legislator, where committees will often break into what are called corner caucuses. This is not a very democratic aspect of enacting laws, but it means the members of the committee break up into their two partisan groups and they go out in the hall and they talk and they often decide what they're going to do. They then come back and vote, which has to be done in public. But when I was in the House, and I don't know about John, we had those discussions right out in the open. And sometimes they weren't pretty, but people could see and hear what we were doing. The last thing I'll say, and that's the third bullet here, this is where the committee may decide they like the bill, or they like it with changes, or they don't like it at all. And then they report it out, and I assume it's the next, yes, it's the next slide that talks about the different report options. Ought to pass means like the bill as it's written. Ought to pass as amended means, well, I like it if we make some changes. Ought not to pass is don't like it at all. And very often the 13 members will divide up into 2 or even more reports. How are we doing on this section? Is it time for, I'm having fun, but is it time for John to take over?
I'm just going to pass it to John as we move out of committee and into the floor.
All right.
Take it away, John.
The first thing that happens when the bill leaves the committee as a committee report is that it goes back to the House that it came from, or that its sponsor, its chief primary sponsor is in. It goes back to that House. And if then the first thing it has to do is that the body accepts the report. They have to vote to accept the report. And in the case of a disagreement in the committee, there will be 2 different reports. There'll be a majority report and a minority report, usually an ought to pass report, possibly an ought to pass with amendments, and then an ought not to pass report. So the first action of the body is to decide which one of those reports it's going to accept. And this is usually an indication of the direction that the body is going in with the bill. And often the presumption is that the majority report gets accepted, but it by no means is always the case. And there can be some legislative tussling at this very early first phase. But until they accept the report, there's nothing more that the body can do with the bill. And then it has its first and second reading in each body, which is kind of a formality. The full bill is actually not read to the body, but it just really gives a breathing space, a little bit of time for legislators to get up to speed and to begin to prepare for debate on the bill and to think about how they're going to vote on it. At the second reading, there is debate and there can be amendments, and this process can go on quite a while. And then the next step in a typical process is for the bill to be passed to be engrossed, which is where it is passed and all amendments that have been adopted are incorporated into the bill, so that instead of one bill and several separate amendments, it's all one package, and that's engrossment. That happens in its original House, and then it gets sent to the other chamber where that engrossment is considered again. If both chambers agree, then it goes to both chambers for enactment, first in the House and then to the Senate. And then once enacted, it goes on to the governor. This is a really simple explanation of the parliamentary process. There are a lot of different steps in here, and there are a lot of opportunities for disagreement and for things to be changed and to go back and forth, and for the bodies to be in disagreement with each other, and then various parliamentary things can happen. But this is the general outline, is that the bill bounces back and forth between the House and the Senate and gets considered several times in each body before it's finally enacted or finally defeated.
And I would just add on that, next to the last bullet, there are exceptions to final enactment in the Senate, and they can come about when the parliamentary maneuverings get more complicated. And in Legislature 101, we don't need to get into motions to receive and concur and adhere and all of that. But it is possible parliamentarily that the Senate might actually, well, let's say the House enacts a bill, the Senate enacts a different version. If it goes back to the House, they can agree with the Senate and enact it as the Senate did, and that's where it ends. But the general rule is that final enactment occurs in the Senate.
So after enactment, then what? Sorry about the pronoun here. The governor gets the bill. The bill physically is moved to the governor's office, and then the governor has a certain amount of time to consider what she's going to do with the bill. She can sign it immediately into law. She can veto it. Or if she's not sure, or if she has some ambivalence about it, she can allow it to become law without her signature. And at the end of the session, any bill that's passed in the final days of the session, if the governor does not sign it, it does not become law. It is vetoed, and that's called a pocket veto. So those are the four major steps. When the bill is vetoed, it must be returned to the chambers. It must be returned to the legislature, and they are given the chance to vote to override the governor's veto, and that takes a 2/3 vote. Occasionally, there is some debate that occurs with that override vote, which is usually held on the veto day that we discussed before. If a bill is signed into law, there's two pathways to its effective date. If it's an emergency bill, it takes effect immediately. But an emergency bill can only be passed with a 2/3 vote of both bodies. So it's usually just more consensus legislation that can get through with an emergency, what's called an emergency preamble, and can take effect immediately. More often what happens is that a bill takes effect 90 days after the legislature adjourns. And this can be a substantial delay. I mean, if a bill is passed on February 10th and enacted and signed by the governor, it won't take effect until 90 days after the legislature adjourns. Well, the legislature will probably adjourn in the middle of June. So that would be sometime in September when that bill would take effect, even though it was enacted and signed in February. And the reason for this is that the Constitution allows the public to have some say on bills as well, particularly the people's veto mechanism. If legislature passes a bill that a sufficient number of people disagree with, they can collect signatures for a people's veto effort during that 90-day window. And if they collect sufficient signatures, the bill does not take effect, and then there has to be a popular vote on it. So that's the main reason why that 90-day delay is in the law.
Great. I want to stop here again for a minute just to get to some questions. So let's see, looking at a question here. To go back to committee hearings, how do we know where to get a link to be able to testify in a public hearing?
The legislature has a pretty good website, and when you go onto their website, there's a pull-down menu for committees. And if you pull down the committee of jurisdiction, that if you know what the committee is, you can pull down the committee on that pull-down menu, and there will be instructions there on that page for how to submit testimony or how to sign in to get on the list to provide verbal testimony during an actual public hearing. If you don't know what the committee is, the committee assignment is printed on the bill when it's in its LD form, so that you can pull up the bill in its LD form on that same website and look to see what committee's been assigned to, and then follow that same process.
Well, before we're done, if folks are interested, either you or one of us could pull up the legislature's webpage and screen share it.
That's a good idea. If I don't botch it, I'll do my best to get that up so everyone can see that before we're done. Next question here. Are bills tabled and they get resurrected in the next session?
That's called a carryover. If by the next session you mean the second session of the same legislature. So, for example, we just started the first regular session of the 130th. A bill could be carried over to the second regular session, January of 2022. If it isn't enacted then, it dies and one would have to start all over in the 131st legislature by submitting a bill.
Mm-hmm. Great. Next question. There are a lot of LRs right now. What's the difference between an LR and an LD? And who typically works on the language of the bill?
Well, LR refers to, I think the R means reviser. In any case, it's a number assigned by the nonpartisan professional office of the revisor of statutes, and only they can write legislation, the official document. John or I could give them something fully drafted right down to the period and the comma, but until they have gone over it and posted it, it's not an official legislative document. And the list of LR numbers, it's interesting to read all those titles, some of which are more revealing than others, but whichever those LRs ultimately become legislative documents, the LR number goes away. It bears no relationship to the later LD number.
Mm-hmm. So just to expand a little on this question of who writes the legislation, is it often legislators that actually write the language that's submitted to the revisor, or is it someone else? Is it a combination?
I would say if this organization submits a bill, it's probably been written by John or me. Legislators, if they're not working with an organization such as ours, they're probably going to give 2 or 3 sentences to somebody in the revisor's office and let them figure out how to actually draft it.
Yeah, I remember when I first got to the legislature, I was sort of shocked that lobbyists were writing some of the bills. And now it's actually almost mandatory to have lobbyists write your bills. It's much more quicker to get your bill into the process if you have it really fully written and submitted, so that the revisor's office doesn't have to do a lot of research and drafting and thinking about how to approach a certain topic. So most bills do come in written, either mostly written or even completely written, and just submitted that way. And then they're put into the final format as Bob described.
Great. I have a quick question here I actually meant to get to at the beginning, which is, Bob, what's your organization? What's your association?
Well, I'm a principal at Howe, Cahill and Company. My partner is Pam Cahill. We're both former legislators. I served in the House, Pam served in the House and the Senate, and served as Secretary of Senate, all in the last century.
Great. Thank you. I see John is typing in an answer for one more question, so I'll let him handle that. But we can go ahead and move on to the last little section of this. We actually just have one slide on this, and then I have another question slide to wrap up the main presentation. But I was hoping that both of you could give us a little insight on what to expect with this year's legislature in particular. And John, do you want us to take this one to start?
Yeah, sure. I mean, it's an interesting time in the legislature. The fact that all the chambers and the governor are all controlled by the Democratic Party changes the dynamic somewhat, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it's the era of good feelings and everybody's going to agree on everything, particularly since the fiscal challenges are very real. And a lot of what the legislature's, most important business is deciding how much it can invest in programs for the future of the state, and which programs are going to get that investment, and whether to, raise revenue. So those are going to be some pressing issues this time around. There is, I think, a certain amount of, what I see a lot of activity in the area of elections and democracy. It's something we've always followed, but this year I think it's fair to say that any objective observers say there's a lot of bills and a lot of ideas floating around in this area. And then also in terms of climate and energy and our energy future, I think there's a lot of activity in that area. And I think the governor's got some bills and some omnibus bills and other individual legislators moving forward with ideas on the climate as well. So I think those are two areas that are really going to be active. But I think the number of bill proposals that went in was just, was substantial. It was not, notwithstanding COVID and everybody, the fact that they're not actually meeting in person, but still just about had the typical number of bills. I believe almost 2,000 titles were put in at one point or another.
Let me say this about party control. Notwithstanding the fact there's a trifecta, I still expect we're going to see tensions. I would call them inter-chamber tensions. Even though the Democrats control both in the House and the Senate, we're likely to see some tensions between the two parties in those chambers. And I can think of one example that we were involved with in the last legislature, where the Senate Democrats were much more willing to clamp down and prohibit contributions from lobbyists than their counterparts in the House. The COVID changes, I think, have largely to do with how the public can participate in the process at the committee level.
There's another question on whether the governor submits regular legislation or just the budget. And the governor can submit legislation at any time. And different agencies of the government sometimes have special authority to submit legislation to committees, proposals that can go directly to committees, and committees can consider them. So yes, the governor has a very broad legislative role in proposing legislation.
Well, thank you for all of that really, really helpful information. I know this is stuff I work on, and I definitely learned more than a couple of things in what you all have talked about. I want to pause and give people a chance to ask any more final questions we have. And also, I just want to encourage people to stick around so I can share a little bit of other upcoming events we have as well. But thank you so much, John and Bob, for joining today.
Will, if I can just make, if we have any time, I just make a concluding remark that I think it's important to say, and in a session like this, and that is, it's really important to understand and kind of demystify this legislative process so that you feel comfortable engaging with it. And sometimes the legislature is not as user-friendly, and there are traditions and there's archaic rules and there's terminology and jargon that is not very user-friendly to the general public. But I would just say, remember that the legislature is your legislature. They're your representatives. They work for you. You have a constitutional right to participate in the legislative process and to speak your views at legislative proceedings. And I just hope that nobody feels intimidated or nervous or deterred from fully engaging in the process, because that's when the best results happen. And it really is and should be open to anybody to participate in, even if they're not an expert, or even if they're not a paid lobbyist, or even if they can't go up there and follow every bill. It's still your process, and I hope that you'll feel ownership over it.
I would add to that that most legislators want to hear from their constituents, and I find at public hearings, some members of the committee find it rather endearing that a member of the public who's never done this before shows up and, gee, Mr. Chairman, I'm kind of nervous, and the chair will reassure this person it's fine. Just tell us what's on your mind. They see and hear us lobbyists all the time. I think they genuinely like to hear from the general public. So, and they're pretty accessible. They're not surrounded by by hordes of staff the way members of Congress in some of the larger states are there. And you'll find on the legislative website, many of them have listed their home numbers or cell numbers. They do that. They're willing to take calls at home. Get to know your representative, get to know your senator.
Very well said. And I see we have had a couple questions come in, so I will make sure we get to these. This first one is, can you speak a little bit about gerrymandering? I heard it'll be happening again this year because of the new census. How can people get involved? And also let me open this up a little more broadly. Just talk about the legislature's role in redistricting, since that will be happening this year.
So under the federal Constitution, the United States has a census every 10 years. It's a requirement of the federal Constitution. And after that census, all of the U.S. Congress districts are the boundaries are examined to make sure that the population is equitable among all of the different districts, more or less equitable as possible. And then the states do the same thing. The states examine their internal boundaries for their internal state legislative districts to make sure that those boundaries are equitable as well. And the phenomenon of gerrymandering is when legislators realized that they could draw those districts in a way that created legislative political advantages for certain political parties. And so the party that's in power at the time that the legislative redistricting happens can, fortify its power by the way it draws the maps for the legislative districts. Maine has, I would say, a minimal amount of partisan gerrymandering because our Constitution has a provision that says that basically both of the major parties need to agree on the maps in order for them to take effect. And if they don't agree, the maps go to the Supreme Court, which is well regarded as a nonpartisan court. So we don't have the situation you have in states where a partisan legislature is dominated by one party, draws the maps that favor its candidates, and then that's the end of it. So we're fortunate in that regard. But how can people get involved? Well, the process will begin later this year as soon as the data becomes available from the federal government, and our state redistricting commission can start looking at the data, and they will have a public hearing in which members of the public are invited to testify and comment on their work.
I would add this about the process. In creating House and Senate districts, they tried to come up with districts, say on the House side, that each have very near the same number of constituents. Likewise, the Senate. And as John said, the House is now what? About 8,000. I think it was about 6,700 when I was in the House, and the Senate is what, 40,000? Which is why you will see some districts straddle municipal boundaries or even county boundaries in order to find a district that has the requisite number of people.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you. One final question. Are all the bills for the session signed by the governor on the same day? Just take them as they go.
No, the governor can sign the bill at any time within 10 days of the time that it's presented to the governor. Sometimes she'll sign it immediately, sometimes she'll think about it. And sometimes if the legislature adjourns, as happened this past year, was a very kind of interesting situation where there was a special session and the bill sat on the governor's desk until the following legislative session. So it was a number of months before the governor really decided what to do with the bill. It's a good question, but no, they do not get signed on the same day. During the legislative session, the governor may sign a handful of bills, periodically on a day-by-day basis, just to get them off her desk.
Great. I think we've covered all of the questions. So again, I just want to thank both of you so much for taking the time to speak with us today. I know the process can seem really mystifying from the outside, but getting this, walkthrough of how it works, and then something I found really helpful is actually just, following a bill through as it actually goes through, which I know will be the focus of one of our upcoming sessions. It's all, there's a lot to learn, but it's not so impenetrable. So thanks for helping to demystify it a bit.
Happy to do it. And it looks like you had a good turnout, Will. I saw the number up to at least 55 participants.
Yeah, I'm very, very pleased and heartened by people's interest in our advocacy and in the Maine Legislature. And with that, let me tell everyone about our upcoming sessions. So this was session 1. We just had how a bill becomes a law in Maine. And then next week, we will be doing effective ways to contact your legislator. And then following that, we'll be doing the tracking the issues you care about, as I said, and maybe that will actually be the place we'll do the screen share where you go to the website and walk through all that, because it is pretty complicated and I want to make sure I click on the right things when I do that. So definitely check out that session. And upcoming sessions after that are as I mentioned, the how did it get this way, kind of a history of the Maine Legislature and how we ended up at all of these quirks of this really interesting system that we have here. And then session 5 will be Advocacy 201. So maybe we can get more in depth on some of these things of legislative process, of effective steps after you talk to your legislator for the first time, all of those sorts of things. So I'm really excited for the rest of the series, and I'm really excited for our week of action. That's coming up starting February 8th. We are going to be having webinar events almost every day that week. We're going to be kicking off on February 8th with Secretary of State Shanna Bellows joining us for a great conversation and Q&A session. And then I know we have a session on PC statehood planned for the next day, which you can find all of this on our website. Go to lwvme.org/events, and you can sign up for all of these and all of the great things we're doing. So with that, I just want to thank everyone for joining today. We really, really appreciate this. We couldn't do this without all of you. Please get in touch with us. The session is recorded and we'll be sending out all the slides. So all of this stuff is handy and available for you to refer to anytime you need. So with that, I will wish everyone a good evening and see you all soon.